everyone, thanks again for all your support on my original Castlevania Dominus Collection video. All of the thoughtful comments, new subscribers, the likes, it all means a lot to me. And I want you to know I hear you. So here's part 1 of hopefully what will be a 3-part series for the DS games included in this collection. So I want to start this off with sharing some brief memories I have of its original release. I hope you enjoy. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, originally released in the United States in early October of 2005. But I want to set the stage for you before we really get into the game and its story. It's May of 2005, and it's been 2 years since Aria of Sorrow graced us on the Game Boy Advance. A new issue of Nintendo Power just hit our mailboxes, and there's over a full page of information about the upcoming Castlevania DS video game. The Nintendo DS has only been on the market for several months at this point, so eagerly we read on, analyzing each of the screenshots, our imaginations running wild at the possibilities of what awaits us in the fall. It's hard to believe this was all 19 years ago. Man, that makes me feel old. But before we dive into it, I did also want to poke fun at my original DS copy of Dawn of Sorrow, because I have the notoriously hideous Konami's Best version. I did have the original from when it launched, but somewhere along the line, I misplaced or sold it, and years later, I ended up purchasing this abomination. Whose idea was this? The front cover is a picture of the original box art. I would love to know how this got approved. It's so bad and notorious that I really wish they included a scan of this box art in the extras of the collection, if for no other reason than to give players a good laugh. But since they didn't, I made it a point to include it here. You're welcome. Now, I did notice there's actually quite a few people that commented on my previous video stating that they've never played the DS games before. So even though this game is almost 20 years old, I am going to respect that and tread lightly in regards to spoilers. Dawn of Sorrow once again has you taking up the role of Soma Cruz, as this is a sequel to Aria of Sorrow, taking place approximately a year after its conclusion. Soma has presumably lost his powers, and after an evil summoner brings forth a handful of enemies, Soma finds himself being aided by a mysterious man by the name of Genya Arakato. Learning that a cult is seeking to resurrect Dracula, Soma sets out to try and put an end to this endeavor. Over the course of his journey, Soma will meet Julius Belmont and Yoko Belnades, whose last name should be familiar to those of you wise to Castlevania lore. And if you're not, all you really need to know is that the Belnades and Belmont clans have worked together in the past to put an end to Dracula. The other thing you should know is that your lack of knowledge for the lore of this franchise is a sign that you need to play more Castlevania games. Please, go get the other collections pronto. But in all seriousness, I really enjoyed the story in Dawn of Sorrow. It has the usual tropes of the series, but it also has some twists and turns along the way to keep it feeling interesting and engaging. Returning from Aria of Sorrow is the tactical soul system. This allows Soma to absorb souls from almost every enemy in the game. They have different drop rates, and therefore getting some of them can prove to be tricky, but I think the effort is adequately rewarded since there's quite a few souls that are a blast to use. There are 4 different types of souls to earn, with blue and red souls being active ones that require a button press to use. But then silver and gold souls are passives. Silver souls are tied to your progression and grant abilities like being able to swim underwater and double jump. Gold souls allow for increased resistances or boosts to stats like strength and luck. Taking the time to earn souls from the different enemies allows you to create a build that you find fun to use, and that's the beauty of it. There's so much variety in the system, you'd be hard-pressed to not find at least a few you enjoy using. And when you do settle on a build you're happy with, you can make it even more powerful by acquiring additional souls of that particular monster up to the maximum of 9. You'll also find at a few different points that your progress forward is blocked without a particular soul. Most of the time, these areas make it pretty clear what you need to proceed, but there are a few spots that can be frustrating because they leave you guessing with vague hints, and even when you figure it out, that soul you need might be a 20-minute grind to finally acquire. That's not the only use for souls though, as Yoko allows you to fuse souls with weapons, to evolve them into a more powerful variation. This idea feels ahead of its time looking back at it. You gotta remember that in 2005, having any sort of crafting system was not as common as it is nowadays. The equipment system is pretty simple. You can equip one weapon, armor piece, and accessory at a time. The variety here comes from the stat boost provided by armor and accessories, and the many different types of weapons. One-handed swords, two-handed swords and axes, guns, a wide range of weaponry to suit your playstyle. Most of these items are acquired by finding them within the world, buying them from the shop, or receiving them as drops from defeated enemies. Having the enemy information on screen at all times while you play, which is the default screen layout in the Dominus Collection, allows you to easily track enemy drops, so you can farm to your heart's content until you receive your prize. Beyond that, they also added a compendium which supplies you with a lot of extra information you didn't have available to you in the DS release. The best part about the customization Dawn of Sorrow allows is that you can create two builds and switch between them at the press of a button. I usually opt for one luck-based build, which I use all the time with the exception of boss fights, where I use my more powerful equipment. I don't know how Soma manages to switch all of his equipment instantaneously, but I'm not questioning it. It's a nice touch to a game already deeply robust with its combat. In addition to souls and equipment, Soma will also grow more powerful by earning XP and leveling up. This part of the gameplay is there, and you're aware of it, but you probably won't pay much attention to it. That's mostly because the game never felt difficult enough where I thought I needed to grind XP. It's a fair challenge, no doubt, but never felt unfair or too difficult. And hey, if you're having trouble, no sweat, right? Because you can always use and abuse the newly added rewind feature. Throughout Dawn of Sorrow, you'll be treated to a slew of different baddies to defeat. Plenty of them are staples to the franchise: bats, skeletons, zombies. All of these are essential for it to be a Castlevania game, right? You'll also see some familiar foes reused from previous Metroidvanias like Symphony of the Night. There's also a ton of new enemies that each have their own patterns, strengths, and weaknesses that you'll need to adapt to in order to quickly dispatch them. Replaying through this left me amazed at the sheer variety there is across the enemy designs. Each one felt so unique and intricate, even down to their death animations. It made combat feel that much more satisfying to see how much effort went into even the finer details of these designs. Some even have interactions with a specific attack, like these maids for example. If I use the vacuum on them, you can see their dresses being affected by the suction. Now that's some attention to detail. The bosses are exceptionally well designed, and I felt like the bulk of the difficulty in Dawn of Sorrow came during these battles. After depleting a boss's health pool, but before the boss can be fully defeated, you need to seal them away. This system was only used in Dawn of Sorrow, and therefore is exclusive to this title. If you play this on the DS, you use the stylus or your finger to trace the pattern in order to seal them away. But if you fail at doing so, they'll regain a portion of health, and you'll have to defeat them again in order to have another crack at it. The same seal system applies in this re-release, but they added in the ability to use button presses to mimic tracing the patterns. There's also a few sections where you have to remove ice blocks with the touchscreen, and that's handled solely by using the right thumbstick and right trigger to replicate the touchscreen input. I think the developer M2 did an admirable job remapping the touchscreen functions in Dawn of Sorrow in a way that doesn't feel cumbersome or overly clunky. Thankfully, Dawn of Sorrow is the only DS game in the package to place an emphasis on the touchscreen functionality, so you can expect a more traditional control setup in the next two titles. The world design in Dawn of Sorrow is a high point for me. It felt like a lot of effort was put into enemy placement and the fast travel locations. Some of the smaller rooms contain enemies that have rarer drops, which allows you to grind them more easily. This felt very intentional. The placement of the fast travel pedestals also felt very intentional to help minimize tedious backtracking for the player. Both of these things are aspects I appreciated, especially since the world is seemingly open from the get-go. Now, obviously your progress will be blocked on several occasions in true Metroidvania fashion, as you lack a specific soul you need to progress, but that's the aspect of its design that forces you to explore. For the most part, you aren't really given guidance on where to head next, so keeping track of where you've been and why you couldn't proceed in a specific area is very important to remember. So make sure to make a mental note every time you reach a progression blocker so you can return to it later. I think this part of Dawn of Sorrow might be my only complaint, truly. There were a handful of times where I felt like I was aimlessly wandering around trying to find that singular spot the game wanted me to be in order to obtain the next ability to progress. I couldn't be too annoyed at this though, since traveling through the world, searching every nook and cranny, usually meant more souls and some new drops from enemies. And on top of that, the pixel art is beautiful to look at. It looked great back in 2005, and it looks even better now. The art does not at all look worse on the big screen. If anything, it actually looks better. You know what else? We haven't even mentioned the soundtrack yet. What an absolute treat to listen to, from start to finish. It has a few classic remixes of tracks like Vampire Killer and Bloody Tears, but it also has some new tracks that are absolute bangers. Dracula's Tears and Pitch Black Intrusion are two of my favorites here. But what are some of yours? Let me know in the comments which tracks are your favorites. The last thing I want to mention before we wrap this up, and this isn't really spoilers, but just be aware that I'm about to talk about post-game content, is that you unlock some goodies after beating the game. There's a sound test mode to listen to the music and voices, boss rush mode, and also a Julius mode. Oh, you can also use your save file to play through again in New Game Plus too. In Julius mode, you'll play as a Belmont, so therefore, you have a whip attack and the traditional sub-weapons. The game is fundamentally the same, with the main differences being a few new story scenes and a different final boss. Julius plays like the stiffer Belmonts from the NES era where you can't whip in 8 directions. Playing through this mode was fun, but I felt like it left a little to be desired since you don't acquire anything new other than 2 additional companions. I think this was inspired by the concept from Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, and while it's a fun bonus, it didn't feel as must-play as your initial playthrough with Soma. Each of the 3 characters has their own set of sub-weapons, but they share their HP, MP, and XP, so it ultimately doesn't matter which one you choose to play as. I'll also say that if you like a challenge, this mode is for you. To me, it carried a much higher difficulty than Soma's story mode on the default difficulty level. Dawn of Sorrow is a wonderful experience, and well worth playing almost 20 years after it first released. It does a great job at setting the foundation for the DS games to come, while also building upon what players loved about Aria of Sorrow. It checks all of the boxes for what makes both a great Castlevania game and a great Metroidvania, but I think it's hurt a bit by a confusing sense of progression and the usage of the touchscreen, which I'm willing to bet is something they heard after its release since they axed that component from the next 2 titles. It's aged incredibly well, but I think its sequels surpass it. I think it's my least favorite on this collection, but I can't say that for sure until I replay both Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia. I appreciate you watching this through to the end, and I hope you enjoyed my review of Dawn of Sorrow. If you did, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and also let me know in the comments below what you thought if you played Dawn of Sorrow. Is this your favorite DS game? Let me know. But until next time, have a good one.